Hey everyone, I'm Nicholas, and in this video I will cover everything you need to know about the Federal Protective Service, or FPS for short. I will cover its core functions, responsibilities, individual duties, additional duties, its jurisdiction, authority, history, rank structure, report structure, organizational structure, it's the training to get into it, the requirements for it, it's the equipment it uses, its collaboration with other agencies, its past operations, etc., etc. Anything that, pretty much anything I can fit into the video without it going over my video editing platform's time limit. If it does happen that I have more stuff than I can fit into my video editing platform's time limit, then I will just make it into. I'll add the extra stuff to a part 2 video and I'll post that later. Yeah, so I'm Nicholas, and you're watching the Law Enforcement Agency Information Channel. The Federal Protective Service, or FPS for short, is a full service, civilian staffed, uniformed protective United States federal law enforcement agency that falls under the United States Department of Homeland Security, or DHS for short's Management Directorate, which falls under the DHS, which falls under the executive branch of the United States federal government. The FPS is a somewhat unique agency considering that while it is an objectively uniformed agency, it also maintains both a protective and investigative function. Anyways, the FPS is the primary and de facto police force of the DHS and is primarily responsible for protecting and policing federal properties that are owned or leased by the General Services Administration, or GSA for short, and the DHS. So this would include federal courthouses, federal office buildings, federal facilities, federal land borders, and many others. This would not include federal non-real properties such as national parks, national forests, national fish and wildlife reserves, federal waters, etc. This would also not include BOP federal correctional facilities, the White House, the U.S. Capitol, the Pentagon, the U.S. Supreme Court, um, military installations, etc. Again, while the Federal Protective Service protects a wide array of federal properties, roughly 900, it does not protect every single federal property out there. You know, it the one of the main things is that it protects civilian federal properties. Like I mentioned, it does not protect military installations, even though they are federal properties. They are not owned or administered by the GSA or DHS. They are federal. They are military properties. Military federal properties. They are not under the Federal Protective Service's responsibility, even though they have assisted occasionally in the past under some memorandum of understanding agreements. So essentially, you won't be seeing them, patrolling around military installations such as Area 51. That is under the authority of the respective military police that is for that installation, and the respective civilian police officers attached to civilian federal police officers attached to that installation. Yeah, but that's handled by the Department of Defense. Anyways, or yeah, it varies. Anyways, the main duties of the FPS are number one, patrolling and facilitating entry and exit within and around federal properties, including federal buildings, facilities, etc., throughout the United States, responding to emergencies at or nearby federal properties, investigating crimes taken on or against federal properties or the federal employees actively within them, uh, conducting uh, field evaluation assessments into the security measures of federal properties, in order to ensure compliance with, federal with security standards, to ensure that, essentially, to ensure that, there is uh, that nobody can really breach the facility or building very easily, and that Homeland Security standards are met. But then also, oh yeah, and they do those every like 3 or 5 years. But anyways, they another duty is collaboration, working with fellow law enforcement agencies, and just agencies in general. From federal, state to local. And then also, I mean, yeah, responding to emergencies at or nearby federal properties, etc. Additionally, the FPS is also responsible for providing, sorry, is also responsible for providing significant law enforcement and security and emergency response presence during national special security events, such as the Super Bowl, Olympic Games, etc., in coordination with federal agencies, federal, state, and local agencies, such as the Federal Emergency Management Agency, to ensure Homeland Security. Now, again, this is not one of their main duties. So you're probably wondering, why do they do this then? Well, it's essentially because the FPS, it is, like I mentioned earlier, the armed federal police force of the Secretary of Homeland Security. So the FPS can be deployed by the Secretary of Homeland Security to essentially do whatever the Secretary of Homeland Security prescribes, as long as it is related to Homeland Security. And the way that this works is that national special security events, they require significant law enforcement and security due to a heightened risk for terrorist attacks, criminal activity, and other Homeland Security threats. So thus, the FPS will provide significant law enforcement and security in coordination with other law enforcement agencies during such events. As again, it's for the sake of Homeland Security, and as a DHS agency, the FPS, it does also have that greater responsibility for such. Additionally, many national special security events do take place at federal properties, or even near federal properties, so it is still somewhat within their responsibilities. And then also, another additional duty is providing training to tenant agency police forces, and just tenant agencies in general, on how to on basically emergency management and security measures and planning. But yeah, I mean, they also may be used or utilized for supporting DHS objectives, when either, when essentially, like, so for, yeah, so basically for like securing DHS objectives like immigration enforcement operations, particularly when either, taken on or nearby federal properties that are mandated by the GSA or DHS, at the request of fellow DHS agencies, under a memorandum of understanding agreement, or at the request of the Secretary of Homeland Security, they will provide, they will secure those objectives. So, for example, the FBS has been seen, securing, or the FPS in the past has been seen, protecting, securing, basically preventing or controlling mass demonstrations during, immigration enforcement operations by, for example, U.S. Border Patrol agents within. So, for example, let me just rephrase this. The the FBS has been seen controlling large crowds during immigration enforcement operations by U.S. Border Patrol agents on, for example, buses generally within, cities inbound 100 miles from a U.S. land border, since that is where the USBP maintains the most authority to conduct, or the authority to conduct warrantless searches and seizures. So yeah, they have been seen, basically preventing the crowds and mass demonstrators from, interfering with those immigration enforcement operations. And they may do so generally when there is agreements with both agencies or at the request of the Secretary of Homeland Security, which has been happening recently, essentially to fulfill the recent, uh, quotas set by the Trump administration for immigration enforcement. So, you've probably seen the Federal Protective Service assisting in immigration enforcement or securing immigration enforcement operations much more recently because of these objectives that need to be met. Or quotas that need to be met. So, yeah. The FPS has a long and interesting history. While it isn't the oldest federal law enforcement agency formally, its origins trace back farther than most. In fact, the FPS's origins can be seen tracing back all the way to 1790, 1 year after the formal establishment of the U.S. Marshal Service, our nation's oldest federal law enforcement agency. But anyways, the FPS, was it wasn't established as an agency, but rather a group of roughly 6 night watchmen appointed by commissioners to essentially protect and police buildings that were owned, occupied, or intended to be occupied by the United States. Now, at least at the time, most of these buildings were within the general area that would now be known as the Greater Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. But a lot of their duties were similar to and most likely based upon the Boston Night Watch, which is now the Boston Police Department. But they, I mean, anyways, the commissioners that appointed these night watchmen, they were actually the ones that were in charge of formalizing the District of Columbia upon the establishment of the Residence Act in, I believe, July 18th, 1790. On July 1st, 1948, Congress passed the Protection of Public Property Act, which authorized the federal administrator to appoint special policemen to protect and police federal buildings and facilities. These special policemen would form a force that would be known as the U.S. Special Police, which were charged with public safety responsibilities and duties similar to that of a hospital or campus police department. Their duties included educating visitors on fire safety procedures and standards, preventing and stopping fires and hazards for fires, patrolling buildings, directing visitors, you know, rendering first aid and medical assistance when needed, and you know, occasionally performing traffic control duties, you know, near federal buildings and facilities. But they, at this time, most of their duties were related to the related to really safeguarding the building. They had a guard watchman approach. You know, they weren't really focused on, you know, external law enforcement or even finding uh, you know, threats towards the building. Rather, like just a security guard approach, essentially, except with law enforcement powers. By 1960, the U.S. Special Police's duties had expanded to protecting federal buildings against vandalism, arson, mass demonstrations, bombings, bomb threats, and violent crimes. Um, they, but it wasn't. I mean, it wasn't really until 1949 that the FPS had been formally established. It was on this date that the U.S. Special Police and Night Watchmen were merged to make the Federal Protective Force upon the establishment of a administrative order by the General Services Administrator. Now, this made the U.S. Special Police and merged the U.S. Special Police and the Night Watchmen into one unified force, and it also received the force would be known as the Federal Protective Force, or FPF, not to be mistaken with the Federal Protective Forces of the U.S. Department of the Energy. But it would later become, this would later become known as the Federal Protective Service, and this was really around the time that the officers began to receive their formal title as federal protective officers by the Civil Services Commission. But the establishment of the Federal Protective Force and merger of the U.S. Special Police and the Night Watchmen into it had also led to the expansion of their duties to include protecting federal employees within federal buildings. Beforehand, again, it was just more of a guardsman approach. It did not really include actually providing security details to federal employees, especially important ones, within those federal properties. April 19th, 1995 was probably one of the most devastating moments of the FBS's history, as it was at the time of the Oklahoma City bombing, in which, because it took place at a federal building, the FBS had responsibility over it. Except the FBS had overestimated the need for security there. So it thought that the building was so secure that it didn't even need to provide that many officers. In fact, at the time of the bombing, there was only one Federal Protective Service officer within the building actively. So, for this reason, the FPS got significant criticization and, of course, led it to improve later on. On August 26th, 1996, 11 civil rights demonstrators were arrested by Federal Protective Force officers for disorderly conduct after a chaotic dispute with police in which protesters refused to leave from the Katinsky, don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, federal building during the 1996 Democratic National Convention. But anyways, later on in 2002, Congress established the Homeland Security Act, or HSA, of 2002, in response to the September 11th attacks of 2001, which among the many things that it did, which among the many things that the Homeland Security Act did, um, transferred the Federal Protective Force from the General Services Administration to the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement under the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. Additionally, it also formally changed its name from the Federal Protective Force to the Federal Protective Service. But this act didn't really take effect until 2003, in which the Federal Protective Force was formally renamed to the Federal Protective Service, and was transferred to the authority of the Immigration and Customs Enforcement under the Department of Homeland Security. Now, this additionally also really changed the FPS's focus from basically a more stationary approach to a more emergency response approach. Additionally, it also expanded the FPS's focus to include a increased attention to Homeland Security and preserving Homeland Security, which would include the expansion of duties to things like investigating terroristic threats and other Homeland Security threats towards federal buildings and the federal employees within them, and increasing their coordination with the FBI and other national security agencies. This was also around the time that the FPS began really providing security to national special security events and other events that were, events where there is critical infrastructure that needs that is vulnerable, that is heightenedly vulnerable. In October 28th, 2009, one day and 1 year actually before my birthday, the President Barack Obama formally established, or passed, I should say, the Department of Homeland Security Appropriations Act, which transferred the Federal Protective Service from the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement to the National Protection and Programs Directorate. This was similar to how the Federal Air Marshal Service was transferred from ICE, from the Immigration and Customs Enforcement to the Transportation Security Administration, simply because it did not belong there. So yeah, same concept. In 2020, the FPS was transferred from the DHS's National Protection and Programs Directorate, or NPPD for short, to the DHS's Management Directorate, or MD for short, upon the NPPD's transformation to the Cyber and Infrastructure Security Agency. On June 17, 2019, a lone gunman, now identified as 22-year-old Brian Isaiah Clyde, opened fire at the glass revolving entrance doors of the Earl Cabell Federal Building and Courthouse. Clyde was wearing a black mask and heavy tactical vest with a high-powered assault rifle and 150 rounds of ammo at the time of the shooting. Anyways, as he made his way inside the facility and began shooting, 3 FPS officers returned fire. After a brief exchange of fire, the officers were able to compel the suspect, fatally wounding him.
Shots fired.
Clyde ran towards a nearby parking lot while still firing at the officers just a few seconds before he fell down from the shots he had previously taken. As he fell down, the FPS officers and a U.S. Deputy Marshal from one of the courtrooms inside immediately ran to render aid to him. However, he was pronounced dead after being transported by EMS to the Baylor University Medical Center. Autopsies suggest he died just as he was being rendered aid by the officers due to uncontrollable amounts of bleeding. No one was killed or injured other than Clyde, although one of the federal employees within the building was minorly injured, but dressed so she didn't have to go to the hospital. Additionally, a senior journalist with the Dallas Morning News received a near to miss shot above his head as he was taking photos while crouched behind one of the building's pillars. As incorrectly stated by Wikipedia, it was FPS officers who took down Clyde, not FPS contracted security guards, and the authorities on scene did not necessarily detonate Clyde's vehicle, but rather conducted a controlled explosion on it to see if the car had a bomb attached to it, in which it did. Clyde was a former U.S. Army veteran whose parents divorced when he was around 3 years old. He received his associate's degree and later a job at an aerospace company just before the shooting had taken place. Authorities believe that his motive originated from far-right extremist and violently aimed suicidal ideologies that he had radicalized on himself through the many posts and blogs he made on social media. His brother attempted to contact the FBI prior to the shooting about this, but only described his interest in gunnery and suicide. Because of so, the FBI did not investigate the report, arguing that he had never mentioned his interest to inflict harm to others, just that he was interested in guns and suicide, which of themselves together inherently only imply self-harm, which the FBI generally does not investigate. Law enforcement agencies involved in the response and investigation into the shooting include the Federal Protective Service, the U.S. Marshal Service, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, the U.S. Attorney's Office, and the Dallas Police Department, including its patrol, bomb squad, and SWAT teams. So one of the main things I wanted to point out about this incident was the roles that you saw each one of the law enforcement officers on that scene play in. And the reason why I wanted to point that out is because I wanted to kind of distinguish the Federal Protective Service's role from the U.S. Marshal Service's role and other law enforcement agencies' role in that, those kind of situations. So, as I will get into later, the main reason why that you saw Federal Protective Service officers responding to that shooter first was because, again, so U.S. Deputy Marshals, they are charged with protecting the actual courtroom inside the building. While they have authority throughout the courthouse, they primarily focus and provide security to the actual courtroom when it's within session. So that is why you saw the Federal Protective Service officers responding first, because they are kind of charged with protecting the actual facility itself. So in such an incident where there's a shooter that has not actually reached the courtroom itself, basically it's the Federal Protective Service's role generally to protect the federal courthouse against the shooter. The U.S. Deputy Marshals, they are basically charged with in such an incident, the protocol is for them to protect the courtroom and wait for them to be notified that the shooter is either downed or deceased. Once that is clear, they may, respond. And that's why you only saw that U.S. Marshal until the very end rendering aid to the suspect, because beforehand he was charged with actually protecting the courtroom. But, again, of course, it doesn't really matter, the courtroom at that case, because it's already ended. In any incident of a shooting at a courthouse, the court session will just be ended. So there was no real further responsibility other than escorting the judge out. But yeah, I mean that is the main reason there. And yeah, in June of 2020, amid the George Floyd protests, the Federal Protective Service deployed several of its officers, along with officers that were originally from other federal law enforcement agencies, but were temporarily being deputized by the Federal Protective Service, to Portland, Oregon, to help in assisting uh, in to assist in protecting and securing key federal properties across the city, which were at an in heightened risk for threats due to the mass demonstrations which were going on. Now again, they protected federal properties across the city, throughout the city, including federal office buildings such as those belonging to ICE, federal courthouses, federal monuments, and many others. Some specific locations for which they were seen stationed at include the two federal buildings on 3rd Avenue and the ICE field office in South Waterfront. They responded to several threats and cases of destruction and vandalism. This included reports of verbal threats, physical threats, broken windows, thrown objects, and I mean, also, the use of graffiti on federal properties, particularly federal courthouses and federal office buildings. So again, they were they with as they saw a more necessity for more officers, the Federal Protective Service began sending more and more of its officers to Portland, Oregon, along with officers from other agencies. More recently, the Federal Protective Service has deployed several of its officers from regions throughout the United States to help secure key federal properties, particularly immigration detention centers of ICE and the CBP, and federal courthouses within cities, major U.S. cities that are currently having major mass demonstrations against immigration enforcement, such as cities like Chicago, Minnesota, Los Angeles, Portland, etc. They there were one of the many federal law enforcement officers, though, being deployed to help and assist. Um, Other federal law enforcement officers that were deployed include, U.S. deputy marshals, ICE HSI special agents, ICE ERO, deportation officers, Federal Bureau of Prison officers, U.S. Border Patrol agents, U.S. Customs and Border Protection field operations officers, also U.S. Fish and Wildlife Refuge law enforcement officers. Uh, also like many others. Again, while the majority of the federal law enforcement officers being deployed to assist are ICE and the CBP, some of them are actually not. Some of them are, federal law enforcement officers that are from federal law enforcement agencies that have responsibilities that are not even remotely relevant to, securing mass demonstrations, to securing, federal properties against mass demonstrations. I'm sorry, my lights just shut off. I have no idea why. Okay, that's great. To help secure, some of them are not even remotely relevant to securing mass demonstrations against, against immigration enforcement, to protect federal properties. Again, many of these are just assisting, not anything related to their duties. One of the main common misconceptions regarding the FPS is that the FPS is that FPS officers and agents are immigration enforcement, law enforcement officers. Uh, to make it clear, the FPS, its law enforcement officers are not immigration enforcement agents. It That is a very common misconception. Many people will mistake them for ICE or the CBP. While the FPS used to be a component of ICE, it isn't anymore, and thus it would not enforce immigration. It would not have the authority to enforce federal immigration law unless deputized by ICE or the CBP, um, or if or for some certain other circumstances, like if the Secretary of Homeland Security authorizes it. But this is especially common because many people will mistake their vehicles for ICE or CBP offer. The vehicles of the FPS, they can easily be mistaken for ICE or CBP vehicles because of how extremely similar they can look at certain times to them. Specifically, ICE vehicles and CBP field operations vehicles look the most similar to, I'd say, to the FPS's vehicles. Yeah, I mean but with all this being said, they do work with immigration enforcement agents, such as to protect federal buildings and facilities of ICE or the CBP that are under, especially recently, a increased threat for mass demonstrations. Another common misconception regarding the FPS is that because they have nationwide jurisdiction, they have unlimited authority to enforce any law nationwide, or they can enforce any law nationwide wherever they want. This is not true, and this is a thing that is very commonly mistaken for federal law enforcement officers in general. And just like law enforcement officers in general, jurisdiction just means that you can exercise the specific law enforcement authority that has been authorized to you by respective law throughout a specific territorial or case-related area. In the case of the FPS, they have nationwide jurisdiction, but that is to enforce federal law on federal properties, or in order to protect federal properties and employees within them. Now, while the FPS can enforce, local and state laws, they can only do so really when authorized or cross-designated by localities or states. Other than that, they cannot inherently, enforce local or state laws, and thus cannot conduct traffic stops on you if you have violated one. However, with that being said, many, I should say, not the majority, but many FPS officers are cross-designated with localities and states to enforce their laws. However, not all are. Some, especially like sanctuary cities and that all, do not avoid cooperating and cross-designating with FPS officers, just to because they don't want essentially, they don't essentially want Darth Vader and their stormtroopers coming into their city and taking over as if it's like a playground or something, if you get what I mean. So many cities do not do that for that reason, because federal agents can easily be militarized and used against cities. So like cities like Boston, where I'm from, do not always cooperate with federal agents, especially agents within the Department of Homeland Security. So yeah. The FPS has overall nationwide jurisdiction throughout the United States and its individual territories to protect federal buildings, facilities, and grounds that are owned or leased by the General Services Administration, or GSA for short, and the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, or DHS for short. Title 40, Section 1315, for which the FPS derives its jurisdiction and authority from, gives it broad authority to achieve this, allowing it to operate both on site and off site in order to protect federal properties and the federal employees within them. Now, off-site operations are generally for either investigations, so to investigate crimes taken on or against federal properties, or the federal employees or the federal employees within them. And then number two, for police pursuits. For pursuing suspects who have committed a crime or are suspected of committing a crime while in the presence of a FPS officer. And then number three, to essentially basically find number three, to basically to under the request of the Secretary of Homeland Security. So if the Secretary of Homeland Security basically requests that or gives the FPS some sort of duty that requires off-site operating, such as national special security events that don't take place on federal properties for which the FPS has jurisdiction over, then they may operate off-site in order to achieve or carry out those duties. But another important thing to note is that the FPS, while it has jurisdiction over, several tens of thousands of federal buildings, facilities, and grounds, it primarily focuses on those that are owned or leased by the General Services Administration, or GSA for short. This is mainly because they are generally the ones that they're the ones that they have protected for a while throughout their history, and because they are generally the ones, or sometimes the ones, that lack the most security due to the fact they do not always have their own official police force. But anyways, aside from that, when it comes to the FPS's authority, FPS law enforcement officers have authority to carry firearms, issue warrantless arrests, and carry out warrants both on duty and off duty throughout their respective jurisdiction. The FPS law enforcement officers, they can, enforce, local or state laws when authorized to do so, but they primarily enforce and focus on enforcing federal laws. The FPS, training for the FPS varies by specific position and division, or the specific division. It varies by the specific division and position for which you are applying to. So, for example, when it comes to FPS officers and inspectors, they are required to undergo an approximately 26-week long training program known as the Uniform Police Training Program, which takes place at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center in Glencoe, Georgia. Now, this program, it includes a variety of courses, including those covering things like firearm tactics, physical tactics, cuffing and frisking tactics and techniques, emergency vehicle operations tactics and techniques, and facility security techniques. Additionally, again, this is only for recruitment training. Additionally, the FPS officers and inspectors, they also undergo on-the-job training, Specifically, after you finish recruitment training and get into the agency, you will undergo the basically the a 12 week long training program known as the Field Evaluations and Training Program, which takes place again at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center in Glencoe, Georgia, um, uh, which focuses on agency specific tactics and techniques. Now, again, the training program the reason why they undergo such long and intensive training is because a lot of the areas for which these officers and inspectors will be covering include vast remote areas of land that are generally not the nearest to a local police department. So very often uh, they will have to rely on state police or even themselves for when it comes to assistance. So oftentimes, so that's why, I mean, that is mainly why uh, their training is so long and intensive. In fact, the FPS is the training program their recruitment training program, the Uniform Police Training Program, is actually the longest training program at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center in terms of duration. But when it comes to special agents, on the other hand, they generally undergo an approximately 12-week long training program known as the Criminal Investigators Training Program, or CITIP for short, which takes place at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center in Glencoe, Georgia. Now, this training program includes again a variety of courses, such as those covering firearm tactics and techniques, physical tactics, emergency vehicle operations tactics, uh, facility secu- I mean not facility security techniques. Sorry. Also, I mean investigative techniques, interrogation techniques. I mean uh, also uh, also cuffing and frisking techniques, and other key tactics and techniques. Additionally, just like FBS officers and inspectors, they also undergo on-the-job training, which generally focuses on threat mitigation and other key techniques. When it comes to the report structure of the Federal Protective Service, the Protective Service itself reports to the Undersecretary of Homeland Security for Management. As the Federal Protective Service, it falls under the Management Directorate of the Department of Homeland Security, hence, it reports to the Undersecretary of it. And the Undersecretary of Homeland Security for Management reports to the Secretary of Homeland Security because, again, it falls under the Department of Homeland Security, hence reports to the Secretary of Homeland Security. And the Secretary of Homeland Security, because the Department of Homeland Security, which it leads, falls under the executive branch of the U.S. federal government. It reports to the head of the executive branch of the U.S. federal government, which is the President of the United States. The rank structure of the FPS from high to low is in the following order. Director. The director of the FPS is responsible for leading and managing the FPS as a whole. Below that is deputy director. The deputy director of the FPS is responsible for co-leading and co-managing the FPS as a whole while serving as the first line advisor to the director. Below that is chief of staff. The chief of staff is responsible for overseeing all FPS agency-wide operations, such as those for you know on-field duties and activities such as those for recruitment. Below that is assistant directors. The assistant directors of the FPS are responsible for leading the different directorates of the FPS. Below that is regional commanders and special agents in charge. Regional commanders are responsible for leading the different regions of the FPS, while special agents in charge are responsible for leading the different field offices of the FPS. Regional commanders, it is important to note that they generally oversee more employees than special agents in charge, considering that the majority of the FPS consists of uniformed officers and inspectors, and that there are more field offices and regions of the FPS. But anyways, below that is deputy regional commanders and deputy special agents in charge. Deputy regional commanders are responsible for co-leading these regions, while deputy special agents in charge are responsible for co-leading these field offices. Below that is watch commanders and assistant special agents in charge. Watch commanders are responsible for leading different investigative divisions of the FPS within, a specific directorate of the FPS, or within specific directorates of the FPS, while still operating under a specific region, while still operating under a specific region of the FPS. The assistant special agents in charge, they're responsible for leading the different investigative divisions of the FPS within the respective directorates of the FPS that they correlate to. But anyways, and then while of course still operating operating within their respective field office. Below that is supervisory officers and supervisory special agents. Supervisory officers are responsible for leading a unit or a group of uniformed officers and inspectors within their respective division of their respective region of the FPS. Supervisory special agents are responsible for leading a investigative unit or group of special agents within their respective division, within their respective region of the FPS. Below that is senior special agents and lead officers. Senior special agents are responsible for guiding, the officers within their respective region, while serving, as the more experienced special agents within their region, while lead officers basically do the same, but for special agents. But I meant before uniformed officers and inspectors. But anyways, below that is special agents. They, investigate crimes. And then below that is inspectors. They conduct a mix of investigative and uniform duties. And then below that is officers, which, which protect federal buildings, facilities, and grounds they have jurisdiction over. The FPS works with several law enforcement agencies from federal, state to local. At the federal level, the FPS works with a variety of agencies. Most commonly, the FPS can be seen working with fellow civilian uniformed federal police forces, such as the PI police, over protecting their properties, which they generally share concurrent jurisdiction over. And because of that, they generally share duties when it comes to patrol and response. Additionally, because many of the agencies that the FPS works with, as I mentioned earlier in the video, are maintain both a protective and investigative function, the FPS also works with them over investigating crimes taken on or against their properties. So yeah, I mean, they additionally they also work with for example, just an example for that, when it comes to what I was saying earlier, the FBI police, that's a uniformed federal police force, but it is a component of the FBI, which is an integrator and investigative agency, and the FBI, because of that, hence it maintains both a investigative and protective function. So the FBI and the FPS do frequently work with each other, but different circumstances. Like, for example, the FBI, its special agents work with the FPS special agents over investigating crimes. Most often because on crimes that are taken against federal properties or the employees within them. Not always are the properties that the crimes are taken on are a part of the FBI. But then when it comes to the FBI police, its police officers frequently work with FPS uniformed protective officers over protecting FBI buildings and facilities. But the FPS also works with the U.S. Deputy Marshals over protecting federal courthouses. The vast majority of the federal courthouses out there, civilian federal courthouses, are under the dual control, under the dual jurisdiction of the FPS and U.S. Marshal Service. They also work with several other law enforcement agencies, such as the U.S. Postal Inspection Service over investigating crimes taken against federal buildings and facilities, or the federal employees within them via mail. They have there is a broad array of federal law enforcement agencies they work with. But at the state level, the FPS can be seen working with state troopers and not all, particularly when it comes to mutual aid in rural areas, because a lot of the federal facilities that the FPS provides security to are very vast, and the FPS, it protects a vast array of lands, and there are not always local police stations nearby to assist. So very often, there'll be like state troopers providing assistance for that. But again, I'm not going to list every single state law enforcement agency they work with out there, because the FPS, it operates nationwide. There are way too many for me to list, and they do most likely work with literally every single state law enforcement agency in every state of the U.S. Because at least at certain circumstances or under certain times. But some specific state law enforcement agencies they've been seen working with include the California Highway Patrol's helicopter unit and the Ohio State Highway Patrols, and the Ohio State Highway Patrol, I meant. But anyways, at the local level, the FPS can be seen working with probably the most frequently, like most law enforcement agencies, because there are such a wide array. Again, I'm not going to get into it because there are way too many local law enforcement agencies for me to cover that the FPS works with. There are being that local law enforcement consists of the majority of law enforcement in the U.S. There are over like way over 17,000. But the FPS generally works with them over essentially, they'll often have agreements over, mutual aid during emergencies at federal properties. So oftentimes the FPS will have set agreements with local law enforcement over basically providing assistance during emergencies at federal buildings. So, for example, if there is an active shooter at a federal building, the generally local law enforcement has the obligation and the authority to respond due to just in general, it's because of the agreements with between the agencies, but also because it just in general, if there is an active shooter, it is generally there is just generally in terms of jurisdiction, generally that is put in a way because of the urgency. It doesn't really matter whether the officer is outside or not. It just matters that the officer responds regardless of jurisdiction. Usually the officer will not be like suspended or anything for responding to something like an active shooting, even if it's outside his or her jurisdiction. But yeah, they work with several local law enforcement agencies, including the NYPD and several others, especially during national special security events where an increased security presence is needed due to the infrastructure is being classified as critical. So yeah, they frequently work with them over that. Another common misconception regarding the FPS is the misconception that you need federal law enforcement experience in order to become an FPS officer. That is not true for any of the positions within the FPS. No position within the FPS requires federal law enforcement, or for that matter, just law enforcement in general experience in order to join. No career position, none within the FPS requires it. While it is absolutely helpful in terms of getting in, it is not an actual requirement. And literally, all I suggest is when it comes to joining the FPS, what will more likely get you in? I mean, of course, federal law enforcement experience and law enforcement experience in general is absolutely helpful, and it will increase your chances of getting in. However, I'd focus, if I were you, on getting a degree, because that is really what they look for in such positions. But yeah, that's pretty much it. Yeah. For the question, can FPS officers enforce federal immigration law? The answer is yes. FPS officers can technically enforce federal immigration law as officers of the DHS, the primary executive department for immigration enforcement. But they can only they can do so as long as they are on federal property. I mean, they can do so off federal property, but it's only under a few certain circumstances. Uh, the circumstances are really that the officer, the circumstances are really that if they can enforce federal immigration law outside federal property, if it is upon the permission or request of the Secretary of Homeland Security, or if the officer has been deputized by ICE or the CBP, or if the officer is doing so for the sake of protecting the federal property itself, which is a very broad category. Their definition of protecting federal property is very broad, and they have been seen operating off federal property, enforcing federal immigration law for things that are not always that they say are related to protecting the actual buildings themselves, but are not always don't always seem that way. But they anyways they derive their this uh, authority from Title 40, Section 1315. But I mean, aside from this, with all this being said, the primary agencies for enforcing federal immigration law is primarily the ICE or Immigration and Customs Enforcement, the U.S. Customs and Border Protection or CBP, and sometimes when it comes to on U.S. seas or or in other words within maritime jurisdiction, the U.S. Coast Guard, or USCG for short. But so I mean, yeah. But like in summary, so the FPS, its officers can enforce federal immigration law. However, their primary focus and authority is on basically protecting the federal properties themselves, rather than basically domestic deportation and immigration enforcement. For the question, can FPS officers pull you over or stop you for local traffic violations? The answer is, I mean, it really, there's no straightforward answer, because whether an FPS officer can or cannot enforce, whether or not an FPS officer can or cannot pull you over for a local traffic violation, or in other words, enforce local laws, and in addition to state laws too. This is more broadly about just traffic stops when it comes to local and state enforcement. It really varies based upon whether the officer is cross-designated to do so. So, for example, so many FPS officers are cross-designated with localities and states to enforce their laws. And those officers can't legally stop you for a local or state traffic violation. But however, not all are, and those that are not cannot legally stop you for a local or state traffic violation under the 10th Amendment of the United States. With all this being said, they generally focus on enforcing federal law, and if they were to stop you for a local or state traffic violation, it would generally be within a reasonable radius of some sort of federal property. There are a couple of differences between the FPS and USMS when it comes to protecting federal courthouses. The main differences are their focus. Which what I mean by that is the FPS, it focuses on basically protecting the facility courthouse, in other words, as a whole. They focus on protecting the physical property of the courthouse and preventing terrorism and other Homeland Security threats from breaching. Which brings me into my second point. They focus on overseeing the contract security guards that they maintain contracts with to secure those buildings and to secure those courthouses. Also, they focus on emergency response. Unlike the USMS, you will not generally see the United States Marshal Service responding to, just local emergencies nearby courthouses. The FPS is generally the first to respond to an emergency that is not within the direct courtroom of the courthouse. So if, for example, there's a shooting, the FPS will generally be the first to respond and act upon that shooting, because the United States Marshal Service, their marshals are charged with actually protecting the courtroom. So, which now I'm getting into the United States Marshal Service. They focus, on the other hand, on really judicial security, so protecting judicial officials of the federal government. So this not only includes within the federal courthouses themselves, but also outside the federal courthouses. Another thing is that the United States Marshal Service, it oversees the fugitives that are currently within uh, the courthouse. Um, they they provide oversight to those fugitives. Oftentimes, they will serve as their like security details, or not security details, but like rather oversight guards. Like they oversee them. And then another thing is that the United States Marshal Service, it provides direct security to the courtrooms. It serves subpoenas, uh, provides security to the jury. The FPS, it does not provide security to the courtrooms themselves, unless a serious incident like a Homeland Security threat of some sort was to occur within a courtroom of the federal courthouse. Generally, other than that, the FPS would not act within that courtroom, because it is simply within the duty of the U.S. Marshal Service. Another key thing is that the United States Marshal Service, unlike the FPS, the United States Marshal Service, it provides prisoner transport services from federal prisons to federal courthouses. They transport federal inmates to and from federal courthouses. The FPS does not do that. So, in other words, the key main differences, in just very simple terms, is that, think about it this way: the FPS, it focuses on protecting the actual courthouse as a whole. It focuses on protecting it as a federal property. The U.S. Marshal Service, it focuses on protecting the courtroom when active, and the judicial officials within and without those courtrooms. So judicial protectees, they primarily focus on. So that is the main difference. Additionally, another important difference is that the FPS, it only has a jurisdiction over. It has jurisdiction over, again, both have wide jurisdiction over federal courthouses, but the U.S. Marshal Service, it has jurisdiction over any federal courthouse. The FPS, it protects GSA mandated courthouses, which of course consist of the majority, but of course some federal courthouses, such as the U.S. Supreme Court, they aren't mandated by the GSA, and thus would not fall under the FPS's jurisdiction. But they do fall under the U.S. Marshal Service's jurisdiction. So, in other words, that's the primary difference. It's also just important to note that the United States Marshal Service, when it comes to protecting federal courthouses, has a much broader, much stronger focus on ensuring that court sessions can be continued, and that justice can be upheld as a DOJ agency. The FPS, as a DHS agency, focuses on preventing threats from emerging and approaching and breaching federal courthouses for the sake of Homeland Security. It is focused highly on Homeland Security. For example, you will not see a U.S. Marshal responding to a car crash near a federal courthouse. However, you may see a Federal Protective Service officer doing so because it's for the sake of protecting the courthouse itself. It's the U.S. Marshals. They really stick to the courtroom, if you know what I mean, and to protecting the judicial officials. So, that is the primary differences between the two agencies when it comes to protecting federal courthouses.